Excellent. Great. Well, thank you. And thank you to each of the earlier presentations. Gunhild, nice to see you for the first time in many years. Yeah, I wanted to provide, I guess, a different perspective to what societal resiliency is all about, based on some work that we're doing in Ukraine. And what I want to think about a bit, from where I sit as a civilian advisor to a variety of different military organizations, is that militaries tend to talk about resiliency from sort of a victimhood perspective, where we have to design programs and capabilities to protect vulnerable civilian communities against these sort of malign external forces that are out to get them. And so when we talk about capacity building, resiliency building, particularly in the information space, countering what's the acronym now, mis, dis, and malign information, it winds up very threat-centric, right? We spend a lot of time talking about Russian aggression, for example, and you get, memes like this and ideas of the power of our enemies, and our focus really is on, what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainian people, and it's related to the hybrid warfare environment. And you see it resonating in Ukraine among ordinary Ukrainians, where the Russian leadership is really powerfully regarded as being sort of the masters of all things non-kinetic, very influential, very manipulative, very aggressive, and working in Kiev, working across Ukraine, people see Putin's hand everywhere, right? And this ties into the narrative of resiliency, where the question becomes, well, how do we protect the Ukrainian people from what's happening to them, what's being done to them? And I'd push back against this. I think this is a problem. I get where it comes from, but I think we've taken it way too far. And what I see certainly in Ukraine, and I see versions of this in the US, where I'm from originally, talking about Russian influence, for example, is that when we talk about the Ukrainian people, the American people, civil society, as this sort of recipient of action, right, as a group of people who things happen to, we do two things immediately and implicitly. One is that we give a heck of a lot of credit, much of which I think is undeserved, to our adversaries. We turn people like Vladimir Putin into these masterminds, where they're doing all these things to everybody, which I think really overstates and empowers these actions. And second, concurrently, I think we missed the point, where the fundamental issue, as I see it, as I would offer it to you, isn't what other people are trying to do to our societies, which makes us need to be resilient. It's what's happening in our societies themselves. It's these fundamental civil dynamics and fault lines and disagreements and issues that exist in real life, that exist on social media, etc. That's the fundamental crux of it all, to our mind, as I would see it. And if we don't put that first and foremost, we create this self-fulfilling prophecy where we talk about the Russians, the Ukrainians are effectively a community of victims. But before you know it, we've created this narrative where people start to believe it. And I think this narrative really has taken root in Ukraine to everyone's collective detriment. And as sort of an example of this, when we talk about the myth that's been built around the Kremlin in Ukraine as these sort of masters of hybrid war, etc. I mean, if you look back to 2014, and again, this narrative of the Russians having gone in and achieved their effects and done these effective things, etc., I don't think it holds water. Or if you look at the east of Ukraine, from a resiliency standpoint, from an influence standpoint, these were generations of men, women, and children who'd been steeped, immersed in Russian media since before they could remember, right? I remember talking to one of them about what the Ruski Mir was to them. And the third party intervention was, well, they're not going to understand it even because it's everywhere. It's all around them. Like it's too big to see in a way. Like they were in this environment immersively for so long. Local leadership had been outsourced, and again, overtly pro-Russian political figures. The Russians went into the east of Ukraine expecting society on their side with tremendous soft power expectations. And what happened, right? When we look at the response of civilian communities to violence, real violence in this case, not just the non-kinetic end of hybrid warfare. This was a soft power disaster for the Russians. You have communications coming back from men like Strelkov on the front lines saying, why can't I find 1,000 men of the infamous, formidable Donbas coal miner? There's no one here to fight with us. No one's standing up. No one's coming up and stepping up and getting involved. And where is society? And it's not a deserved narrative. And alongside of that, again, we look at what happens in Odessa in 2014 when you had the trade union building burn with pro-Russian forces inside, dozens killed badly. What happens around them? You have Ukrainian patriots, quote unquote, singing the national anthem as they burn alive inside. This isn't something the Russians orchestrated. This was a reality check, a referendum on fault lines in society. This was the ultimate propaganda win for the Russians that they didn't create. You had all kinds of social media commentary comparing the separatists to agricultural pests, except the Colorado beetle, saying, let them burn, leave them in there. Again, these weren't misinformation campaigns, disinformation campaigns. This was society having a mirror held up to it under tension, under stress, and being found lacking, flawed, human, right? The way all our societies are. So, how do we really understand what the Russians can achieve, what they're trying to do, versus looking back at the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian society, thinking maybe the center of gravity is there. It's because of fundamental inherent qualities to the communities of Eastern Ukraine that resistance didn't take root, right? When the Russians pushed in, there was no mass uprising. It wasn't going to happen. It didn't happen. When violence did escalate, there were tremendous atrocities on both sides. Why is that? Again, referendums on society, problems we have. What happened again? Major Russian intelligence operations in Kharkiv and Odessa, trying to instigate uprisings, trying to make things happen in, again, ostensibly ethnic Russian-speaking cities that fell completely flat. Efforts to push into Dnipro, Mariupol, effectively countered by two individuals, powerful oligarchs who were able to mobilize a sufficient number of people to stop this thing dead in its tracks. So this wider narrative of sort of Russian hybrid warfare prowess and this dynamic where we have in our minds, I think, as NATO and in the Ukrainian psyche as well, we've radically inflated the agency, the power, the decisive abilities of our adversaries based on a misunderstanding or an inability to really dig into the depths of what was happening in Ukraine itself on the ground. And I think that if we want to sort of rethink or reframe approaches towards societal resiliency, the two words at the top, I think, are what's key. It's about ownership, right? And it's about responsibility. If we look across NATO, I think, again, barring invasion, we're not talking about hybrid war anywhere, we're talking about war. Looking across NATO, I think our biggest problems are our own problems. Societal issues within our countries that have been, again, I think COVID has been an interesting referendum on this. It's created some certain divisions. It's caused all kinds of different behaviors and responses across Europe, across NATO. I think that we have to look bottom up and really understand the competitive landscape where we're confronting adversaries. We're confronting adversaries in our own countries. day after day after day. It's not necessarily, across the battlefield, but we're there. And we have to understand this from the bottom up, I think. And I don't, as I see the resiliency discipline, it feels to me very top down, very opponent centric. And I think that's a problem. I don't think it should be. I think it has to be very bottom up, very society centric in terms of how we present it and how we go about it. And again, simple stuff, right? Like we're competing against some fairly prolific, manipulators of the truth, let's say, right? And how do you deal with it? How do you argue? How do you win a war of ideas against an adversary that is liberal with the truth? Again, I think step one is to own our own problems, right? To accept that the faults in our society are real. Every society has faults. Let's understand them. Let's come to terms with them. Let's understand how they can be manipulated by others. Let's get our house in order the best we can. Recalibrate how we talk about our adversaries. I think we inflate them quite dramatically in the non-kinetic space. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And another thing I'll talk more about as we close out is the whole DMMI, dismiss, malign information discipline. My honest response from a societal resiliency standpoint would be to kill it entirely. The idea of NATO or the EU or the US government or whomever as an arbiter of what's true is fraud at best. And I'll speak more to that in a minute. So again, what do we take away thinking about Ukraine, thinking about the challenges they've had, the problems ongoing, the prospect of them being engaged again in a hot war again, very soon, potentially. I think from Ukraine's side, again, barring a full-scale invasion, their biggest problems have very little to do with the Kremlin. Their problems are their problems. It's about governance, about nation building effectively in what is still a reasonably young state. All right, it's about dealing with corruption. It's about fostering a civic dynamism that builds on what happened in 2014. There's all kinds of really fascinating, important, great work being done already in that space that broadly they can be just left alone. Let it ride, let it play out. The Ukrainian people have taken the lead there, and they're, from where I sit, doing a heck of a job with it. When we talk about Putin, when we talk about this sort of all-purpose scapegoat boogeyman who's under the bed and behind the scenes and everywhere, the number of times I've been told that, by Ukrainians that Vladimir Putin is the reason for the Trump presidency and for Brexit and forever else you can think of. I mean, it's paralyzing, all right? And it becomes an impediment to action when you transfer agency to someone else. All right, this is a big problem that the Ukrainians, I think, have to come to grips with. Again, embrace the messiness of it all. Again, when we think about a war of ideas, we talk about hybrid warfare. We talk about trying to build societal resiliency. I'm not convinced that that's a grand narrative geostrategic thing. All right, I think it's about what you see when you walk out your front door. It's about local level community building, capacity building, problem solving, etc. And I think we have to lower our gaze, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, when we look at these issues. To hit on the point from the last slide, again, this whole disinformation, misinformation space is huge in Ukraine. And I get why, right? Because they're subjected to tons of it. But my perspective, take it for what it is, if the Ukrainians want to litigate the truth with the Russians, they're going to lose. They've already started to play a game they can't win, and they shouldn't want to win because there's an underlying, I think, inherently kind of totalitarian Soviet-style mentality here, which is that we're going to tell everyone what's true. And I think that if you look at, I don't know how effective they are, but how active the Russians are in spreading misinformation, disinformation, as we would call it. We collectively as NATO, as the West, have floundered in terms of how to deal with that. And I'm kind of glad. I think that's a good thing. I think that it shows our unease with censorship, with defining truth to our citizenry. I don't think that's our business at all. And I think that playing that game is to lose it. And then finally, there is obviously a very serious Russian threat in Ukraine. It's a very real danger to sovereignty, to life and limb, etc., for the Ukrainian people. But let's see it as it is. And I think that the Ukrainians have to come to terms with what the Russians can and can't do, what they do and what they don't do, what they are and are not good at. And I had an interest. The quote at the bottom comes from an allegedly quite pro-Russian Ukrainian political analyst. He's cast as being pro-Russian because he's had political affiliations with various parties in Ukraine aligned to Russia. He's educated in Moscow, etc. This is a guy who knows his opponent, right? And it's, we're talking about a bullet, effectively. And if we can, I think, chip away at, and again, these are his words, not mine. It's a bit provocative, stupid, but dangerous. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. It's punchy and concise and blunt enough that it's the sort of thing the Ukrainians need to hear to break down these myths that have been built up around hybrid warfare. So why are we talking about that here, right? We're here in a CIMIC audience. 80% of us, of you, are military. If you agree with the premise that when we talk about societal resiliency, especially in the information space, that the fundamental problem is not the Russians, the Chinese, or the Islamic State, or whomever who's trying to reach in and manipulate us. It's the fault lines that exist already, right? Where does that understanding come from? How does NATO understand the competitive environment, the playing field here? All right, who's going to do it and how are they going to do it? I think the only answer is simple. I don't know of anyone else who's really looking at this, who's either equipped or inclined to ask these questions, to look at this stuff. All right. And again, this leads immediately into something that the Ukrainians have become quite comfortable with, but I know some at NATO aren't, which is domestic operations. Can CIMIC, will CIMIC operate within NATO member states? I think they might have to. If they don't, who's going to? Who's going to fill this information gap, this knowledge gap? Someone, I think, has to be conducting civil assessments and civil engagements all throughout NATO. All right, not hunting for Russian influence per se, but understanding, again, the features, the fault lines of the human terrain and the ways in which they can be exploited. I think that's, again, a core CIMIC value proposition. And I think I'm, again, very interested in discussion and debate from the CIMIC community on the extent to which you want to do that, you're allowed to do that, and finally, you're trained and equipped to do that. Because again, I'm pushing an agenda here, but if ASCOPE and MECE and these things are your answer to understanding societal dynamics and societal resilience, I think you're in a lot of trouble. So I will stop there. I appreciate your time and attention. Let me stop this and get it out. So thank you for your time.